The town of Pinemont was the type of place that time seemed to have forgotten. Nestled in the rolling hills of southern Pennsylvania, it was a quaint, picturesque village that could have been plucked straight from a storybook. Old oak trees lined its narrow streets, and houses, some over a century old, sat on manicured lawns. People smiled at one another in passing, and every resident seemed to have a sense of ownership over the town's well-being. Its small population, no more than 3,000, meant that life here moved at a slower pace, far from the rush and noise of big cities. Everyone knew each other, or at least thought they did. At the heart of Pinemont stood St. Margaret's Church, a towering stone structure with stained glass windows that cast kaleidoscopic light over its interior during the morning service. For generations, the church had been the spiritual and social hub of the town. Its ancient bell tolled every Sunday morning, calling the faithful to Mass, and its wooden pews had weathered the weight of countless families, many of whom had been attending St. Margaret's for as long as the town had existed. As life in Pinemont was inextricably tied to the rhythms of the church, and no one was more integral to maintaining those rhythms than Father Thomas Mercer. Father Mercer had arrived in Pinemont 15 years earlier, a young man freshly ordained and full of promise. His arrival had been met with excitement, particularly from the older members of the parish, who had grown tired of the previous priest's rigid, dogmatic style. Mercer brought with him a warmth and compassion that quickly endeared him to the community. He was tall and lean, with sharp but kind features, dark brown eyes that seemed to hold the worries of those around him, and a voice that could calm even the most restless soul. His smile, soft but genuine, seemed to ease the burdens of everyone he encountered. At first, Father Mercer had been an enigma. People knew little about his life before the priesthood. He had mentioned in passing that he was from a small town up north and had felt the call to serve God early in life, but he rarely spoke of his personal history, and this only added to his allure. He was a man who seemed to have sacrificed everything for the sake of his parishioners. In time, Father Mercer's reputation grew. He wasn't just the priest who gave inspiring sermons, he was also the one who showed up to help repair a broken fence, who comforted the sick, who stayed late at the church to offer counseling to those in need. He became something of a fixture in the town's consciousness, a man of the cloth who was, above all, a shepherd to his flock. But as with most things that appear perfect on the surface, there were cracks beneath the facade. Among Father Mercer's parishioners was Catherine Lawson, a woman who had lived in Pinemont her entire life. Catherine was well known around town, not because she sought attention, but because she had a quiet, dignified presence that commanded respect. In her early 30s, Catherine had a natural beauty that had only deepened with time. Long, dark hair, sharp green eyes, and a grace that seemed to draw people toward her. She worked as a nurse at the local clinic, tending to the town's elderly residents and anyone who fell ill. Her compassion made her a favorite among the patients, and she had a way of making people feel comfortable, no matter their circumstances. 5 years earlier, Catherine had suffered a terrible tragedy. Her husband, Mark, had been killed in a car accident on a rainy night. He had been on his way home from a business trip when his car skidded off the road and crashed into a tree. All the loss had devastated Catherine, who had been married to Mark for less than 2 years at the time. Mark's death sent shockwaves through Pinemont, a town where tragedy was rare, and where everyone knew the Lawson family. Catherine's grief was palpable, and in the weeks and months following the accident, she became a shadow of her former self. During this time, Father Mercer had reached out to her. He had offered her private counseling sessions, helping her navigate the overwhelming sorrow that threatened to consume her. At first, Catherine had been reluctant to open up. Her grief was too personal, too raw, but Father Mercer had a way of listening that put her at ease, and gradually she began to confide in him. Their sessions became more frequent, and Catherine soon found herself relying on the priest's guidance. To those around them, it seemed that Father Mercer had been a lifeline for Catherine, helping her through the darkest period of her life. As the months passed, Catherine seemed to regain some semblance of normalcy. She threw herself into her work at the clinic, and though she still mourned her husband, she began to find joy in small things again. She joined a book club, started attending church more regularly, and even began volunteering at St. Margaret's, helping to organize events and fundraisers. But despite her reemergence into public life, there was still a sadness about her, a sense that something was missing. It was around this time that people in town began to notice how much time Catherine was spending with Father Mercer. At first, no one thought much of it. The priest was, after all, known for his kindness and willingness to help those in need. But as the years went on, whispers began to circulate. Catherine and Father Mercer were often seen together outside of the church, walking in the gardens, sitting on a bench in the town square, or having coffee at the small cafe near the clinic. But it was clear to those who paid attention that their relationship had evolved beyond that of a priest and his parishioner. Still, in a town like Pinemont, where gossip spread like wildfire, people were surprisingly cautious about speculating too much. Catherine was a widow, after all, and Father Mercer was a beloved figure. No one wanted to jump to conclusions, and even if there were something unusual about their closeness, it wasn't anyone's business. Besides, Father Mercer had never given anyone reason to doubt his commitment to his vocation. He was a priest, and priests didn't engage in romantic relationships, at least not openly. But beneath the surface, things were far more complicated than anyone realized. What most of the town didn't know was that Catherine had started to feel increasingly uncomfortable with Father Mercer's attention. At first, she had been grateful for his help and guidance, but over time his behavior had become more possessive, more intrusive. He would show up at her house unannounced, often late in the evening, claiming that he was there to check on her or offer spiritual guidance. He called her frequently, sometimes late at night, leaving messages if she didn't pick up. Catherine tried to dismiss her growing unease as paranoia. Father Mercer had been her rock after Mark's death, and she didn't want to seem ungrateful or unkind. But as his visits and calls became more frequent, she began to feel trapped, as if she couldn't escape his constant presence in her life. She confided in a few close friends, telling them that she felt overwhelmed by the priest's attention, but she stopped short of accusing him of any wrongdoing. After all, what could she say? That he cared too much. That he was too attentive. None of it felt like enough to justify the knot of anxiety that had begun to form in her stomach whenever he was around. Then it was Emily Mathers, one of Catherine's oldest friends, who first encouraged her to distance herself from Father Mercer. Emily had noticed the change in Catherine over the past few months, the way she seemed more withdrawn, more tense. When Catherine finally opened up to her about her concerns, Emily had been adamant that she needed to set boundaries. "You're not obligated to let him into your life like this," Emily had said. "Just because he's a priest doesn't mean he can dictate your every move." Catherine knew Emily was right, but breaking away from Father Mercer wasn't as easy as she had hoped. The more she tried to create distance, the more persistent he became. When she stopped answering his calls, he started showing up at her house more frequently. Once when she told him she needed space, he would respond with hurt, as if her withdrawal was a personal betrayal. His demeanor, once so calm and compassionate, began to take on a more unsettling edge. There were moments when Catherine saw flashes of anger in his eyes, though he never raised his voice or acted aggressively. It all came to a head in early April, just a few weeks before Catherine disappeared. She had been avoiding Father Mercer for days, ignoring his calls and skipping church services in an effort to regain some control over her life. But one afternoon, as she was leaving the clinic after a long shift, she found him waiting for her in the parking lot. His expression was tense, his usually serene face marred by frustration. "Catherine, we need to talk," he had said, his voice firm but quiet. And Catherine felt her heart rate spike as she approached her car, trying to keep her voice steady. "Father, I don't think this is a good time. We can't keep avoiding this," Mercer pressed, stepping closer. "You've been distant. I don't understand why. Catherine hesitated, gripping her car keys tightly in her hand. I've just been busy, that's all. I need some space. Mace Mercer's eyes flashed with something darker hurt, maybe even anger. You're pulling away, Catherine. After everything we've been through, everything I've done for you, you're shutting me out. Catherine swallowed hard, feeling a lump rise in her throat. She had never seen him like this before, and it scared her. Father, I appreciate everything you've done, but I need to live my life. I need to figure things out on my own. Mercer took another step closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You can't just walk away from this. From us. But there is no U.S., Catherine said, her voice trembling. You're my priest, not my. He cut her off, his voice sharp. You're making a mistake, Catherine. You don't know what you're doing. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Catherine standing by her car, her heart pounding in her chest. It was in that moment that she realized she wasn't just dealing with a concerned priest, she was dealing with a man who had crossed a line, and she didn't know how far he was willing to go. Over the next few days, Catherine confided Emily again, telling her about the encounter and expressing her fear that things were getting out of hand. Emily urged her to report Mercer's behavior to the police, but Catherine was hesitant. What would she say? That her priest was acting possessively? That he had shown up uninvited and made her uncomfortable? It all felt so intangible, so difficult to put into words. And despite her growing fear, Catherine still didn't want to believe that Father Mercer could truly mean her harm. He was a priest, after all, wasn't he? It wasn't until Catherine failed to show up for her coffee date with Emily that the full weight of the situation became clear. It was that rainy April night. After Catherine's unexplained absence, Emily had tried calling her friend multiple times, but each call went straight to voicemail. Concern gnawed at her, and when she stopped by Catherine's house the next morning, she found the place dark and quiet. Catherine's car was still parked in the driveway, and the curtains were drawn, as if she hadn't been home. By that evening, Emily and Catherine's neighbor, Mrs. Jennings, had reported her missing. But what followed was a town-wide search for Catherine that lasted days, then weeks. The police searched the woods, the nearby river, abandoned buildings, anywhere she could have gone. Father Mercer, ever the calm and composed figure, participated in the search, leading prayers at St. Margaret's and consoling the parishioners who were distraught over Catherine's disappearance. He offered his help to Detective Rachel Darden, who had taken over the investigation, insisting that he was just as concerned as everyone else. But Detective Darden wasn't easily convinced. As she interviewed those close to Catherine, Darden began to piece together a troubling pattern of behavior. The more she dug, the more Father Mercer's involvement with Catherine seemed unusual, and she began to suspect that the priest's connection to the missing woman was far more sinister than anyone wanted to admit. It wasn't until Catherine's body was found 6 weeks later that the full extent of Father Mercer's dark obsession came to light. The search for Catherine had consumed Pinemont for weeks, and by the time her body was discovered, the town's hope for her safe return had all but disappeared. It was a muggy June morning, the kind that clung to your skin and made the air feel thick and oppressive. A local jogger, running through the woods on a trail near the outskirts of town, was the one who found her. At first, the jogger hadn't realized what he had stumbled upon. The shallow grave, partially hidden by brush and fallen leaves, looked like little more than disturbed earth. But the smell decay, sickly and overwhelming, hit him like a wall. He froze, his mind struggling to process what was in front of him. Then, with shaking hands, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911. By the time Detective Darden and her team arrived, the scene had already been cordoned off, yellow tape fluttering in the breeze. Forensic technicians in white suits moved methodically through the area, carefully digging around the grave, cataloging every piece of evidence. The body, wrapped in a plain white sheet, was far too decomposed to immediately identify, but there was little doubt in Darden's mind. This was Catherine. She stood at the edge of the scene, watching as the technicians worked, her jaw clenched tight. Despite weeks of investigating and following leads, this was the outcome she had feared from the start. Darden had been a detective for over a decade, and she knew better than to let hope cloud her judgment, but even so, the discovery of Catherine's body hit hard. The small town of Pinemont wasn't the kind of place where people disappeared and were found in shallow graves. Not until now. As the day wore on, Darden's suspicion of Father Mercer deepened. The man had been too cooperative. He had offered his help, led prayers for Catherine, and consoled the grieving parishioners, all while maintaining his calm, saintly demeanor. But Darden had dealt with enough people like him in her career to know that sometimes the ones who appeared most helpful were the ones with the most to hide. After the forensic team extracted the body and began their analysis, Darden received the confirmation she had expected but dreaded the remains were indeed Catherine Lawson. She had been strangled, with bruises on her arms and legs suggesting she had fought her attacker. The signs of a struggle were undeniable, but there were no other overt injuries, no evidence of sexual assault. Whoever had killed Catherine had done so deliberately, methodically, and had taken the time to bury her in a place where they hoped no one would find her. The investigation ramped up after the discovery of Catherine's body, and all eyes turned to Father Mercer. Despite his outward show of grief and concern, there was something off about him, something that set Darden on edge. He had been too involved, too close to the case, and now that Catherine's body had been found, she was determined to find the evidence that would link him to the crime. The first major break came when the forensic team examined the sheet that Catherine had been wrapped in. It was plain, white, and unremarkable at first glance, but further analysis revealed something crucial. Father Mercer's fingerprints were all over it. The prints weren't just faint smudges, they were clear, unmistakable, and placed in a way that suggested he had been the one to wrap her body. When confronted with this evidence, Father Mercer's composure finally cracked. The man who had been so calm, so measured in his interactions with the police, now seemed nervous, his hands trembling slightly as Darden presented the findings. But even then, Mercer didn't break. He maintained that he had no idea how his fingerprints had ended up on the sheet, suggesting that he had simply handled it during one of the church's cleaning days, perhaps before it had been used to wrap Catherine's body. Darden wasn't buying it. She knew there had to be more. The turning point came when she managed to secure a warrant to search Father Mercer's private quarters at St. Margaret's. The church had always been a place of refuge, a sanctuary, but as Darden and her team entered the priest's rooms, it quickly became clear that this sanctuary had been hiding dark secrets. The first thing they noticed was the meticulous neatness of the room. Everything had its place, from the books on the shelves to the neatly folded bed linens. But it was in a small, locked drawer in Father Mercer's desk that they found the most damning evidence. Inside the drawer was a wooden box, and in that box they found Catherine's missing wedding ring. The sight of the ring, glinting faintly in the dim light of the room, sent a chill down Darden's spine. The ring had been a cherished keepsake, something Catherine had worn every day since her husband's death. For it to be in Father Mercer's possession was more than just suspicious, it was damning. But that wasn't all they found. Also in the box were several photographs of Catherine, some taken without her knowledge. They were ordinary, at first glance pictures of her walking through town, sitting on a bench in the park, or leaving the clinic where she worked. But the fact that these photos were in Father Mercer's possession painted a far more disturbing picture. These weren't just the casual photographs of a priest concerned for his parishioner. These were the trophies of a man who had been watching her, obsessed with her. As Darden flipped through the photographs, she felt a sickening sense of clarity. Catherine had been trying to distance herself from Father Mercer, but he hadn't been willing to let her go. He had become possessive, controlling, and when Catherine had tried to break free, he had snapped. When Darden confronted Father Mercer with the photographs and the ring, the priest finally began to unravel. His denials became less confident, his excuses more frantic. He claimed that Catherine had given him the ring for safekeeping, that the photographs were just mementos of their friendship. But the evidence was overwhelming, and Darden knew that it was only a matter of time before the full truth came out. The final piece of the puzzle was uncovered when Darden reviewed Father Mercer's phone records. A series of text messages between Mercer and Catherine in the weeks leading up to her disappearance revealed the full extent of his obsession. The messages started off innocuous enough gentle reminders to attend church services, offers of spiritual guidance. But as time went on, the tone shifted. Mercer's messages became more insistent, more demanding, accusing Catherine of abandoning him, of betraying their connection. The most chilling message of all was sent on the night of Catherine's disappearance: "We need to talk. You can't run from this." With all the evidence in place, Darden had enough to arrest Father Mercer. The day of his arrest was a spectacle. The once beloved priest, who had led the town in prayer and guided them through times of hardship, was now being led away in handcuffs, his head bowed in shame. The people of Pinemont were in shock. How could the man they had trusted for so long be capable of something so horrific? During his trial, the full extent of Father Mercer's obsession with Catherine was laid bare. Witnesses testified about his increasingly erratic behavior in the months leading up to her death, and the forensic evidence: his fingerprints on the sheet, the possession of her wedding ring, the photographs. And the threatening messages painted a damning picture of a man who had allowed his desire for control to consume him. Father Mercer's defense tried to argue that the relationship had been consensual, that Catherine had willingly entered into a romantic relationship with him, and that her death had been a tragic accident. But the prosecution quickly dismantled these claims, using Catherine's own messages and testimony from her friends to show that she had been trying to escape his grip. Catherine hadn't loved Father Mercer, she had feared him. In the end, the jury took only a few hours to reach their verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Father Mercer was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, his once revered status forever tarnished by the darkness of his obsession. As he was led away, the people of Pinemont were left to grapple with the horror of what had happened. The church, once the heart of the town, now felt like a place of sorrow, a reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. Parishioners stopped attending Mass, unable to reconcile their faith with the actions of the man who had once guided them. Catherine's friends and family mourned her loss, but they also took solace in the fact that justice had been served. Still, the wound left by her death would never fully heal. Pinemont had been changed forever, and the memory of Father Mercer's dark obsession would linger, a shadow over the town that no amount of prayer could ever fully erase.